Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be finishing the South Sea Bubble series from Extra History. It's been quite the journey, and we had a significant turn, and now the focus is going on Walpole, who is a significant figure in the 18th century in England, though not one that I'm super familiar with. His name absolutely comes up. I don't know how important he is. I know he's going to be like de facto kind of in charge sort of dude after this, and there's a lot to it that I'm not going to try to explain what I don't know in any sort of significant depth. But I'm very curious about this because, like, if I were to expand my area of study backwards, this would kind of be the period worth studying. So to understand Walpole's rise would probably be one of the earliest things I would do. I studied, like, the early American Republic and, like, the late colonial period. Like, I have a very narrow area of study. So if I were to move back, this is exactly where I'd want to go. So to understand such an important figure, let's do it. And maybe there's more to explore with him, and this is going to open a door for me to study more about the guy. But only time will tell. Until then, let's get started.
Last time, we left off with Robert Walpole seeing an incredible opportunity in the collapse of the South Sea Company, and trying to maintain the very delicate balance between being the incorruptible hero of the people who opposed all this market madness, and pulling the strings behind the scenes just right so that the only horrible corruption that actually got exposed was that of the people who stood between him and being Prime Minister. Unfortunately for him, there...
Okay, yeah, he does become Prime Minister. That's like the thing at the time. The significance of the Prime Minister position is a little confusing to me. Like, I understand what it is now. Is it the same back then? Because, like, as far as that's concerned, like, even in American history, we don't really... Even during, like, the Revolution, we're not really talking as much about the English Prime Minister and stuff. It's just not, like, the type of government figure that ends up coming up as much during that. So I am very curious about how that's going to work out. Clearly, it's a powerful position. For me to even recognize the Walpole name and him being a little bit outside of my area of study, and, like, it means he was important.
There was about to be a wrench thrown in the works. You see, Robert Knight was the cashier of the South Sea Company, and he had secretly been keeping a record of all of the company's transactions, including a list of everybody they'd bribed. If this list fell into the hands of anybody with honest intent, it would bring down most of the political establishment of Britain and ruin Walpole's chance at power. Now, you'd think at this point the government would just raid the South Sea offices, confiscate everything, including this ledger, and take all of the principal actors into custody. But instead, they began to debate how to form a committee to investigate South Sea, which is probably partly due to a lot of prodding from Walpole. This gave Robert Knight time to cook the books, adding legions of phony names to hide just how badly they'd overstepped the government's strictures on what could be lent to whom. But perhaps more importantly, it gave him time to move the ledger, with its list of who they'd bribed still intact, from the company's files into his own personal possession. Finally, though, the government got their act together and called Knight in front of the committee to investigate just what exactly went on at South Sea. This left him with, as one of my favorite commentators on the period put it, 3 options. Tell them nothing, which would leave him in prison for a very long time. Tell them everything, which would certainly bring down the government and probably put him on a lot of people's short lists for a very untimely, very bloody accident. As soon as the day's questioning was over, walk out the door, grab the first coach for Dover, and hop a ship across the channel. Needless to say, he chose option 3. Because this was the government and nobody was working on weekends, no one realized he was gone until the following Monday. With such a head start, he wound his way through France and ended up in Brussels, conveniently part of the Austrian Netherlands, one of the few countries in Western Europe without an extradition treaty with Great Britain. But somehow, and by somehow I mean almost certainly with the help of certain members of government, Knight had managed to transfer most of his money overseas well before he absconded with a certain extremely implicating list of names. So he wasn't exactly inconspicuous as he traveled, living the high life and putting himself up in the most expensive hotel in Brussels. The local British charge d'affaires, who wasn't wrapped up in all the machinations from back home, took notice of Knight's extravagance, and per the official instructions of his government and the public statements made by Walpole, went to have Knight arrested. Of course, this was actually the absolute last thing that Walpole, the king, or any of the Whig elite wanted to happen, and at the last moment, somebody tipped Knight off. It was Walpole. Walpole tipped Knight off, and he attempted to flee again. But this...
So, like, the information... Like, this... is a delicate situation in which like the whole government could be brought down. So I kind of understand like kind of letting this guy go. There's stuff that you want. It's so delicate. Like who knows if this is actually going to go your way.
This time he was caught by our industrious charge d'affaires just before he could slip across the border. He was carted off to a prison in Antwerp, and as news reached England, Walpole, the king, and the Whig elite publicly celebrated and demanded his immediate return. Oddly enough, for some reason, Knight's ledger never made it to prison with him. Who knows where that went? It was Walpole. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Blunt came to the realization that, with Knight on the lam, he himself was just about the only person still around who knew just who Southsea had bribed. Unlike Knight, though, Blunt had far fewer compunctions about selling out his former business partners, so he promptly began selling out whomever he could in exchange for a deal. He only squealed to the committee from the House of Commons, though, leaving the House of Lords completely in the dark. He knew which people he was likely to get a better deal from. This threw everything into chaos, and chaos just happens to be something Walpole could make good use of. On top of this, since nobody had that dangerous ledger anymore, Blunt was just working from memory, and in a stroke of great fortune, the names that Blunt could remember just happened to line up remarkably well with the list of people that Walpole needed to get rid of.
Yeah,
but there was still the threat of Robert Knight's far better memory, which was currently sitting in a jail cell in Antwerp. With the public angrily clamoring for his return, and those MPs who weren't involved in the scandal demanding continuously and publicly to be able to question him, the king was forced to bring Knight back. But since Britain had no extradition treaty with the Austrian Netherlands, the king couldn't just haul him back.
What is so interesting about this series is that I was never the most interested in the guys actually participating in a lot of the maneuvering with like the financial shenanigans. A lot of the guys, like the guys on the forefront of that, I wasn't as interested in them as I was in their actions. I was thinking, like, walking out of this, King George I is, like, super cool because he has, like, this big Chad move where he steps up and he's like, I'm going to be, like, the top dog in this big financial institution or something holding up the government. Like, that's kind of, like... some big schmo stuff he's got going on there. Like, I don't know. I thought that was really interesting. But at this point, he seems like he's more, like... He's kind of like a set piece working around circumstances, while Walpole, he's actually looking to be the more interesting figure, participating in far more of like the manipulation of the situation. George the First, while at first I thought like, oh, there's something interesting there, there's something smart there, but now it just seems like he more fell into place, I guess, than Walpole, who really maneuvers his way up. At least that's the vibe I'm getting from this very limited history of the whole situation.
Since Britain had no extradition treaty with the Austrian Netherlands, the king couldn't just haul him back. Instead, he dispatched a man to go convince the Austrian government to send Knight back to England for trial. The particular fellow chosen to do the convincing was a bit of an odd choice, as he had never performed diplomatic service before, and in fact had no obvious qualifications for the job, other than that he was a close friend of Walpole's. Secretly, this fellow had instructions to convince the Austrians that on no condition should they return Knight to Britain. Ever. Please. In fact, if they could just let him escape, that would be awesome. Walpole then also sent 2 letters to the Austrians. One of the letters demanded vociferously that Knight be returned. The other, which is one of the most extraordinary diplomatic documents I have ever read, pretty much explicitly offered the Austrians a blank check as far as the British were concerned, so long as Knight never came back to Britain. This is the point where history really needs a Benny Hill theme. Parliament wanted Robert Knight back in Britain. Walpole couldn't have him coming back. Parliament offered Knight a royal pardon if he would return to Britain and give his testimony. In response, Walpole's agents in Antwerp quietly told Knight that even with such a pardon, Parliament could still prosecute him. Don't you dare. Since the pardoning attempt fell through, sitting members of Parliament hopped on a boat to sail over to the Austrian Netherlands to question Knight personally. But the governor of the Netherlands, tipped off by Walpole, prevented them from entering the country. Then Walpole convinced the Austrian government to move Knight to a different prison while still pretending he was in the original one, so that any British MPs who happened to show up unannounced couldn't question Knight without their knowing. When rumors started to circulate that Knight wasn't in his original cell in Antwerp, they took him back to Antwerp, put him back in that cell, let someone verify he was there, and then in the middle of the night took him out to the Ardennes forest and just let him go. No one would hear from him again for 20 years. With Knight safely out of the way, Walpole could finally let the...
So somebody is going to hear from him again, is what they're saying. Like, nobody will hear from him for 20 years. So that implies that in 20 years, we're going to actually get something on this guy. So he's going to tell his story. I wonder if maybe that's why we know what we know about this. Maybe that's why this story is going the way he did, because like maybe he came back and actually did tell his story. I mean, this information had to come from somewhere. I don't know how reliable a narrator he'd be, but I could only imagine. I'm going to have to take some time to watch the Lies episode on this one. Even like, though I don't watch those for videos, this is one like... I'm probably going to need the Lies episode for at least to watch on my own.
The hammer of justice come down without consequence for himself. And as that justice hammer was being wielded by a parliamentary committee rather than by the courts, it meant that the guilty were basically trying themselves, and Walpole's now enormous influence could determine exactly where that hammer fell. Whig leaders like John Aislabie, along with notables like the Postmaster General, the First Lord of the Treasury, and the Lord of the Council, either resigned or were stripped of their positions, clearing the way for Walpole to become the First Lord of the Treasury, a position he would use to become what most historians consider the first Prime Minister of England. Many other individuals were fined, but very few served jail time, and even among those fined, very few lost more than they had made from the South Sea Bubble. And those who managed to remain in power all knew exactly who they had to thank: Robert Walpole. As for Blunt, well, since he, unlike his associate Knight, was willing to name names, Blunt began trading for a deal on the people he'd bribed as soon as he could. In the end, he was left with £5,000 to his name, which is still probably more than he had at the beginning of this story. And hilariously, he remained a baronet, a title he had been given for his good work with the South Sea Company a few scant months earlier. In fact, his family holds the Blunt baronet to this day. In the end, when we look back on all of this madness, I think it's important to remember that Britain couldn't have survived without financial institutions like the South Sea Company and the Bank of England. Without them, the government couldn't have carried the debts it needed to prosecute its wars and keep the country afloat. But without oversight, with politicians financially tied to the entities they were supposed to be responsible for reining in, and with the public good being guarded only by the very people who stood to profit from the public good being subverted, these institutions led the national economy to the brink of ruin, and left generations of the middle class to foot the bill. This is a good lesson. I hope we learn it someday. See you next time.
Yeah, that would be great. Like, if you think back, like, to the time that they are... not so subtly referencing, if you're talking about the 2008 financial crisis, yeah, it would be nice. In the United States, we have people who are, like, so financially connected to, like, these massive institutions, like these massive banks and, like, military contractors and all sorts of, like... all sorts of entities that would make you think, oh, isn't that a conflict of interest? Oh, these guys are your biggest campaign donors? And America has a system where it's like, the Supreme Court deemed that money equals free speech, so we do very little to stop those entities from funneling money into people. Like, you're an idiot if you get convicted for campaign finance violations, because it's so easy to get away with that sort of stuff. This was interesting, and I like how they tied that in here. So the bird's getting a little upset here. So at this point, I'm gonna wrap things up real quick since he needs a little bit of personal attention. At this point, I'm going to call it a day on the poll on the community tab when it comes to determining what the next series is. I haven't seen the poll at the point that this video is out. At the point that I'm recording this video, but I assume it's probably Justinian and Theodora, isn't it? They probably won. It seemed like they were winning at the last point I watched it. So we'll see, though. I'm very excited to see what we're going to be doing next, and I'll be continuing Extra History very soon. Probably not even going to be all that much of a wait. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know other series you want me to check out. I'm open to things. I want, or just individual videos. They don't have to be series. Other creators and stuff that you want me to check out on this channel. There's all the potential in the world. Like, I'm open to try new things. We'll see how it goes. All right. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another video or two. All right. Bye.